The next item on the superintendent's report is the Co-Laboratorio final report, Action Against Racism.
Thank you, Chairperson. So yes, I am pleased to welcome two guests for the second item in my report this evening. Doctors June Francis and Christina Henriksen, founders of the Co-Laboratorio, or Co-Lab as we know them, are here this evening to share their final report and recommendations in working with the school district in our journey in action against racism. As the board is aware, Co-Lab has been working with us for over 2 years now. They joined us via Zoom last June to share a preliminary report and their emerging themes as they had been and continue to meet throughout the summer months to be deeply engaged in listening to and learning from the many stakeholders of the school district. Before I welcome presenters to the podium, I just would like to acknowledge a few staff here tonight. District Principal Beth Applewhite, District Principal Rob Smith, and our Executive Director of Human Resources, Harpinder Hoti. Addressing the racism that exists and achieving racial equity can be, and will be a very difficult journey. And I am deeply, deeply grateful for the expertise and leadership that Beth, Rob, and Harpinder have provided, not only to myself as superintendent, but in leading work in the school district. So thank you. Also with this final report this evening, I would like to thank Deputy Superintendent Roberto Bombelli for his work in leading the team in this first phase of the engagement process. So thank you, Roberto, very much. I should also note that the invitation to hear this report this evening has been shared district-wide with all our staff and all our parents. So we do have individuals joining us via Zoom tonight to hear the report. And Doctors Francis and Henriksen have graciously agreed to let us record tonight's session so that we can share it with staff at a later date. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. June Francis and Dr. Christina Henriksen to share their work, the final report. None of us has had the opportunity to read through the findings, so we are very eager and interested to hear from them tonight. Thank you for making the time to join us here. Welcome.
Put this here, there's things I can't read from my system. So that's why I'm putting my computer there. First of all, I too would like to say that we work and live on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we just wanted to acknowledge that as well. As we come here tonight. We also want to thank the same people, Brenda, Beth, Robin, everybody else that has been, I see you there, Superintendent, that have been foundational to this work. It would have been absolutely impossible for us to do it with the support we've received. We've received widespread support at every level of the school district, with our last listening session actually occurring just less than a week ago, or just about a week ago. And so we have been going through the summer, as you said, and ongoing until the very last minute, so that we could hear from so many people. So
I just also additionally want to really thank for invaluable facilitative and dialogue support from Dr. Elder Roberta Price, yes. And then also, who is not here, part of our BIPOC engagement specialists, Joshua Robertson and Balkis Yama and Tamara Robertson-Fry.
Yeah, they were our youth engagement specialists, and again, were really helpful in having young people engage with them. And so that was incredibly helpful. I will be taking the talking role. We've introduced ourselves in the past. And I think in the interest of time, we'll just proceed unless you think otherwise. We'll just proceed with the report. I did want to start by saying that this work has been deeply personal to me. I was born in Jamaica and I had a colonial education. I personally was taught to hate who I was. I was taught that my heritage was not valuable. I could recite every single poem of Wordsworth or Shakespeare or Chaucer, but not a single word of the poetry of my own land. I did not know the history of slavery. I was not taught the history of the great traditions of Africa, Asia, and all the other traditions that made Jamaica great. Certainly knew nothing in any depth of the indigenous Taino First Nations people on whose land we were placed. I had an incredible colonial education in the sense that I was steeped in all the ways in which I was able to succeed in the world around me. But I didn't have the education that would sustain me as a person and who I am. I therefore take this work very seriously because I think it's critical that we all get the kind of education that supports us and allow us to thrive. On the other hand, there was a good part of my upbringing. I was born in Jamaica where Black people were the dominant group. And so I grew up in a place where I belonged and it sustained me. I grew up in a place where I felt loved. I grew up in a place where I was expected to achieve. And the girls in my class were the best at math. I was top in my class at math. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be able to do these things. So on the other hand, I understand what belonging feels like and how it creates an enormous amount it gives you what you need to thrive. It allows you to be resilient. It allows you to go through life with a sense of your own capacity. So I come to this work deeply interested in ensuring that no child ever is taught to hate themselves and that every child feels love, safe, belonging, and can thrive. Because I think it's the most important aspect of us as humans in modern society, the kind of education experience that we receive. So today, as I present this report, I just wanted to share that with you. I know how to do this. I don't know why it's not going forward. Okay. So thank you. I want to start by thanking the participants. We had so many people willing to share their stories with us. And the cost to them at times was great. I think about last week as we sat in a room with the Tigrin community here in Burnaby, not at the school, one of many groups that we were meeting, and how everyone sat so patiently as their words were translated well into the evening, so we could hear their stories and their individual stories and about their children and their hopes and aspiration. And I realized the investment in time and burden is important, but all of this was done because the schools, across the teachers, the administration, the parents, the kids that came out, and we met a lot of kids, there was a hope for change, a hope that through all of this effort, they will bring their stories out and that it will make a change. And so tonight, as I present this report, there are two things we're going to present. First, I'm going to present the findings from these sessions, and then we will talk about the recommendations or our suggestions, our solutions, our suggestions for change, many of which came out of these sessions, but of course also from our professional experience. Some of what you'll hear tonight will be hard. I just want to preface it. None of this is being said to wound, it's just to create truth. People have shared their truths, and I will share it. And at times, it may feel hard to accept or to hear. The second thing I'd like to say is, for many people who are in the public, especially who are listening to this presentation, it may trigger some response. I might refer to things that you have experienced, and I encourage you to seek help or take the time you need to process this, or to listen to it at another time, because some of this may, in fact, trigger some very deep emotions. So with that said, I just wanted to say again that our engagement followed from the commitments that was made by this board and the district. And the very first thing that was done was the district-wide survey. And we went back and looked at 10,000 open-ended responses from that survey, in addition to the closed-ended response. So we looked at that, and it helped provide the basis. And so many parents and families and teachers and others were involved with that. We then undertook a series of confidential interviews with administrators, senior leaders, school safety specialists, support workers, Indigenous leaders, elders, counselors, and most importantly, again, students. Some of this was done in individual interviews to ensure the safety and confidentiality and according to the requirements of the situation. Others were done as groups. We had focus groups, listening sessions. Some were they were all intergenerational. No, we had intergenerational meetings and then student meetings, but we had many intergenerational meetings. Those intergenerational meetings, some of which were held as individual meetings with specific groups, again, to create safety. Some were with groups that were cross-racial, cross-boundary. So we provided a number of different avenues, met with an Indigenous group separately, Tigrayans, Arab, Farsi speaking communities in particular, as unique groups to create that additional level of safety. So that's just some context. Again, we met with BIPOC teachers in groups, as a group. So some were individuals, some were groups, all were confidential, and all of them involved quite a lot of listening, quite a lot of deep listening. Because as you know, the school district, again, bold commitments to address systemic racism. And Gary Wong, I quote you up there, Councillor Wong, you had some really thoughtful words to say about listening to the lived experience, how important that was. And the consultation process itself was intended to inform the development, and that's how we took it, of a district anti-racism plan that respects and honors the voices and lived experiences by those affected by systemic racism. And so what our work is today is input into that final district action plan. As you know, and I won't go into all of this in the interest of time, but the survey results were deeply troubling. I know that those results have been presented to you. You have heard those results. And so we saw levels of reported racism at the interpersonal level, microaggressions, students to student behavior, systemic issues, issues related to leadership, power, the lack of representation, and also a sense that the leadership is predominantly white, non-Indigenous, across teachers and staff, and a sense of a lack of understanding and at times denial. And as I listen to the performance and the student outcomes tonight, I'm always reminded that it's really important for all of us to recognize that a system that can be very good for some may not be so good for others. This is not an indictment of every child across the system. It is recognizing that some students are not experiencing it in the ways that others are. So the goals of the deeper listening was really what we were looking for, is to get, the survey gave us some insight into what was happening. As I said earlier, we knew that the surveys were, telling us that people were experiencing, students, staff, administrators and others were talking to this issue of racism in the schools. And it was coming out quite strong and quite clearly. Our deeper listening sessions was to try and understand the root causes, to go a bit deeper, and then pivot to trying to figure out how can we change this? What are the things we can do to make new possibilities, to create new outcomes for students? So what are some of the things we found? As you will recall, when we talked about the survey, some of these categories were dominant, came out, they're naturally the way the school is organized. And so we are going to present much of our findings in the same way. Well, because in fact, it's interesting how much we heard that certainly went deeper than the survey, but also supported many of the findings in the survey. So there was a lot of concern around administration, leadership, policies and procedures. There was concerns about curriculum, of course, teacher diversity, student-to-student relationship, teacher-parent community issues, and issues about the kinds of resources and support that students were receiving. So let me start by talking about administration, leadership, policies, and procedures. What did we hear? Well, we heard a lot. And I am trying to think if I can read it. That's why I'm looking at it. I'm gonna come a bit closer. I have a loud voice and probably would still be heard. So the first one had to do with policies, a lack of policies for senior leaders, a lack of policies for senior administration and staff in the district when discussing race, reporting, and addressing racism. People talked to the fact that they could not find policies, and they felt that policies, in fact, if you read this, and it's a direct quote, and I'm going to read it, the hierarchy over time, and I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, it's just a little small for me. The hierarchy over time has coordinated into hierarchy of oppression. I found that hard when I heard it, when I heard that. Even the process of anti-racism is being completely controlled and restricted. There's a sense that leadership don't understand. not realizing that policies and governance imbues them with, and that these are barriers, that there are policies that are out there that are creating barriers for students and for the systems. There's a sense that people are not motivated for change, and yet I hear tonight, and I hear it constantly, that there is a commitment to change, but parents in particular, and many teachers and many students actually don't believe this. They don't believe there is real commitment to change. They think that this is performative, very performative. We were asked to share stories of racism, but after that, no one cares. The hope for the survey finally showing that we're experiencing racism, and they felt that people went through the survey and the results were not forthcoming, and there's a sense that they were waiting for change. They wanted to know what was happening, and some people felt that they were told just to sit with it. So what does this mean? It means, I think, that people are not getting the sense that there is real urgency on the part of leadership. There's a sense that the leadership may not have really the perspective to understand how deeply this affects them. And there's a sense of denial and delays, and that there's little motivation. Now, this is not that, this is true. It's what people are saying and feeling. And I think it's important to always recognize that there can be an inconsistency between intent and what is being perceived. So it is important to know that's what people are feeling. And I think there's been an urgent call for action. This I can say. And I'm going to read this in entirety, bear with me. And the reason I'm reading it is because I think this response encapsulates so much of what was being said. And it's a series of questions that is being asked of the school district. How do you plan on solving racism when your board, superintendent, principals have not been trained or don't want to learn or have no experience because they're mostly white and don't care? How do you think this will help? What are your policies on racism? Why don't you list consequences for racism? Why don't you hire teachers, principals, and board people who have a background in racism? You're hiring people who don't know much about these issues and then ask our kids to teach the class about special days. Instead of focusing on celebrations and holidays, please teach our kids the tools on how to stop being racist. Hire more First Nations and put them in charge. Why have my kids not ever had a Black teacher or a Black principal? If you continue to hire white bosses who deny racism is real, then you're going to continue to be a racist educational institution. I told you that some of this response would be hard. This is one of the harder ones. When we look at responses about teacher diversity, capacity, and practice, we heard a lot about the fact that, and I'm going to quote from an academic because I think it encapsulates what many of the comments on the right-hand side, which are from students sometimes, from parents, and from teachers and others in the community, especially within the school community, have said. Considering that white educators are removed from the racialized students' experience of economic marginalization, language barriers, leading to isolation and consequent mental health struggles, degrading treatment from people in authority and fellow students, they unfortunately worsen these conditions with uninformed treatment of students. And again, most people did not think there was an intent to harm, but there was some deep senses in which parents felt harm, their children were being harmed, and they felt being harmed. And this has to do with a variety of things. We'll get a little bit into some of them, but including a lack of tools they felt was out there to address racism. So there was a lack of tools to recognize when racism was actually occurring. A lot of students talked about that something will happen or the teacher would demand something or ask them a question or poor expectations and other things. And when they would say, we believe this is because of our race, or try to raise that an issue, it was often not accepted as a reason. There was very little, what's the word, inquisitiveness with the students to say, why do you think that? How can we talk about this? Students felt they were shut down very, very quickly as soon as they tried to express themselves. They also really were quite upset about the curriculum and the decision-making around curriculum, feeling that it's still focused on the Eurocentric culture. There is, I'm going to tell you, something really interesting I heard. And that's why change is possible. And that's why the efforts that you put in all around is so important. So one of the parents, Indigenous parents, I heard a lot of really difficult things from Indigenous families, but one of the parents said, you know, my young daughter came home from school and I was going to have that discussion with her, you know, about what does it feel like to be in school as an Indigenous child? And it's because I'm saying there have been some positive change with Indigenous inclusions, but not for other groups. And it's beginning to turn the tide for Indigenous children, I think. The young child said, I love being Indigenous. I am cool. The kids are learning about my culture and they think I'm cool. I thought that made, I mean, it was such a it just is such a rewarding feeling, because I know that a lot of effort has gone on recently in trying to change that trajectory. And when a kid in kindergarten can come home from a family that was expecting a completely different answer, says, I feel pretty good about being Indigenous because I'm cool. Because my friends are learning about who I am. And everybody thinks I'm cool. Because I think it does matter so much that people are represented. And there's a troubling amount of concerns that there's over-disciplining of impact students in relation to white students. And I heard this was probably a universal thing that was said. And it's important to know that a person's truth is their truth, right? It's important to hear. And it's hard not to be defensive about that, but it's important to hear it. It's their truth. And many people talked about the teachers. We heard a lot from teachers in particular about why there are not more diverse teachers entering and advancing. IPOC teachers are not highly represented as far as parents are concerned in the school system, and from the statistics that is observable. We'll get to data in a second. It's hard to know for sure because I have not, we don't collect certain kinds of data, so we don't know what the actual number is, but there's certainly a perception that the school district, and I think it's true, there's a far gap between the communities that are coming to the schools, the communities that are being served, and who is represented at leadership and among the teacher population, although I believe the teacher population is more diverse than the leadership. And teachers talked a lot about the recruitment process, that they felt that there were a lot of impediments that may remain hidden to the dominant culture. And this is one of the things why I think there is so much pushback, by the way, in the United States about critical race theory. Because one of the things critical race theory underscores is that what may be so transparent to say a Black person or a person of color, an Indigenous person, may be completely opaque to the dominant group. We may be looking at exactly the same thing and seeing completely different things. And so when teachers of color were starting to talk about some of the obstacles, there were things that you know what they are, but they were really interesting obstacles, things that I, and not being a teacher, I'm a Black person. And they started to talk about all the ways in which, from trying to get into teacher college, and they talked about how, even going through school, even the pathway to how you become a teacher. If you're an immigrant, or you didn't grow up in this country, or you're not from a family that knows how to go to university and knows how to set yourself up for university and how to save for university and all the things you need to do, if you're not being guided by others into the profession, first of all, you don't start to prepare yourself and take the necessary steps. But then they went on to talk about things like, and you would know this better than me, the number of hours they needed to volunteer in practicums. And they said, we couldn't put that time in because we needed to work. And when I was applying to Teachers College, they wanted to know how much volunteer work and hours I put in. And I said, none. I have a child, I'm a single mom, I can't volunteer. And they said, well, you need to show certain things to get into college. And she went on to say how difficult that was for her to invest the time. So there are a lot of obstacles that may not be obvious as to why, I'm sure school board saying, we're not stopping Black, Indigenous, or people of color from applying. It's not as if you have a sign up outside saying, do not come here. But the point is that there are hidden obstacles that if we want to be attractive, we're going to have to really address at universities and in other ways. And we won't solve it tonight, but it's important to look at the systemic barriers to why teachers, and by the way, when people of color don't see a lot of themselves in a profession, we know they also don't gravitate to it. Right? Because they feel either that they're going to be isolated, or they feel there are some obstacles in that profession. And especially if you're an immigrant, you want to get into a profession that you feel that you're going to do well at. So when you don't have diversity, it actually hinders diversity. Let's talk a little bit about the feedback on curriculum and learning. A lot of feedback, extreme lack of diversity in the curriculum and the decision making. There's a lot of discussion about who sets the curriculum, but mostly ideas that they felt were they use this term, outdated accounts of ideas and methods throughout the curriculum, which concretize racist perception and reinforce them as others. And let me give you an example that was given. One example they talked about is, do we ever talk about the Haitian Revolution? Although we do talk about the French Revolution, don't we? The whole ways in which the curriculum is so constructed that so much, and parents actually said, I know the school thinks it's up to date, but it's actually outmoded because it's not opening up to the vast wisdom of Asian history, of history of West Asia, of the great traditions and poetry of the Farsi people. How can you teach art and not bring in the artistic traditions that inform Pablo Picasso, the African traditions? How can you teach a curriculum and kids don't know any of this? And what they said was, when kids don't know the wealth of traditions that come from being Asian or from being Farsi or being Arab or from being African or from being indigenous, they don't value themselves. And so they go on feeling as excluded people. And so it's and othered. And so this was a deep, deep problem for parents and for students. And they felt that teachers have relinquished the responsibilities. And often will say, well, okay, this is the curriculum. But they felt that they often will even relinquish the responsibilities to the students to say in non-productive ways, because in fact, this is very nuanced. Students often say, I want to be included in the classroom, but I don't want to just say, you know, how we celebrated, you know, Eve. I want to talk about the deeper history of my people. I don't want to just tell you how we dressed on a holiday. I don't want that superficiality, because it reinforces the idea that we're really not serious people. And the other thing is, I heard tonight that one of the things in the inclusion metrics was around asset-based learning, to strengths-based learning. And one of the things that students is mentioned, and parents as well, is that instead of appreciating the diverse talents and worldview and seeing them as assets. So when an Eritrean student comes to the class and says, and there is, you know, bringing all of that history of coming from a part of the world with some of the oldest traditions, instead of seeing this as, wow, in the same way we see international students, right? We talk about international education. We say, bring them here so that our students are exposed internationally. But we're international. We come into the classroom, but we're, instead of being seen for what we bring, we're seen as people who lack something, as problems. We can't learn English quickly enough. And the other thing they talked about, and is the ELL, which I'll come to in a second program, but we are not seen as assets. Instead of seen as polylinguists, you know, some of us come with many languages, just not English. That could be, you know, this is an asset. We should be celebrated, you know, we could be celebrated for our capacity to sort of tell students what concepts are in 3 languages and how interesting it is to be able to think of a concept in this language and that language and this other one. In other words, what they're saying is we bring something to the classroom and not enough attention is being paid in the curriculum to realize the assets we bring. Instead, we're just like, we didn't learn English, and so we become a problem to the society. A lot of discussions around language. I'm sorry, the titles are behind that sharing screen. I didn't know that we know more about the technology in the future. I'll kind of know how to do these slides better, but this one is about students. You know, there's a lot of discussion around language. We heard a lot about people feeling they were treated poorly. They felt that there was over-disciplining of students of color in comparison to white. But there was a quote over here I'll read. When you have language barriers or from Africa, they act as if you're not the same and do not listen to you. They feel that our children are not treated equally or expected to make the same progress. My child was constantly being separated from the class. If something happens, it's always the Indigenous kids who are suspect. They're blamed for everything in the schools. And these issues affect their grades. What I heard was IPOC students do feel great harm and a failure to thrive. Again, some groups feeling it more than others, but some deeply troubling stories to hear. And people told their stories one by one. I mean, these were not generalization. These were on September 8th, I came to the school and this happened. On on December, I did this. I tried to fix it, but nobody listened to me. There's a disaffection, there's a sense, and there's a deep sense they feel that they and their kids become pathologized. That is, something is wrong with the child. Quickly pathologized, or something is wrong with you or the child, instead of maybe something is wrong with the context the child is in, or how the child is experiencing school. And so that came up a lot. Low expectations, very prevalent across many groups. Low expectations. So teachers would celebrate, parents and kids, they aspire to the same thing as everybody else, even if they're immigrants, even if they're, and suddenly they're being told that it's okay if you perform at a subpar level. And many parents weren't convinced that that was their kids' achievement level. I want to make a point about language skills because it's a nuanced point, and I think it's important. And this is the one, the fifth one down, the equation of language skills and accent with intelligence, compounded stereotype. So what kids were playing was that they may be really good at math, or they may be really good at all sorts of things. But because of their language skills, they were being streamed to do, to perform at a lower level in everything. And not enough innovation around how to deal with this. And kids were saying, kids know how to deal with this stuff. They're going, I could just, do the same math and I could figure it out because I have, Google Translate and other things. I might be able to figure out how to perform high in these other areas if I'm allowed to, but I'm often constrained by this one thing. And people are talking about, the ideas, but teachers would say, but the syntax isn't right. And a lot of this, and they really did single out ELL as an issue, I must say, it came up a lot. Student to student relations. There is a real, kids, I have 3 kids, they went to school. I always think the playground is a tough place. A lot of harm occurs in the playground. We know that, the kids, the students to students. And let's just say in a society that's racist, and I think we can all accept now that Canada has systemic racism. Children come to school already understanding these dynamics, and they exploit it and they try to use it. And the children experience social isolation, and they feel there's little protection from abuse. So they're isolated by what they call bullying, and they feel the school system does not protect them. And the isolation is really compounding. These kids don't get invited to birthday parties, some of them. They don't get included in social issues. And you may say to yourself, so the the kids were saying, people saying the N-word and other slurs with impunity. Kids are getting away with this. And often what happens, some parents will say, is a kid eventually reacts. You know how that goes. Some kid eventually does something in reaction, and it's the reaction. It's a bit like in sports, I don't know. You know, I know I played netball, which is like basketball, and somebody would elbow you, right? And then you would eventually just elbow them back, and then you'd get blown, and you're like really upset because you're thinking like, did you see what was going on here that made me eventually elbow them back? And it's the elbowing back that often gets punished. And the original thing that's just festering goes unaddressed. There's minimum, students feel that there's not enough consequences. In fact, they think there's zero consequences. There's a sort of call them in the room and say, that wasn't nice. And they said, the kids just go back outside. And the thing is that what the kids are saying is that if the school does not have a zero tolerance on this, the kids take it as license. They go, nah, we'll get away with it. So sometimes it's just the teacher doesn't know strategies and not using them as teachable moments. Right? Not enough reflection time in the classes. There are exercises that can be done to cause kids to reflect, to talk about racism, to reflect on strategies that kids themselves can use. Not enough addressing it head on. So they continue to feel isolation. There's also a sense in which not enough is being done by the school to create social cohesion. If kids are not being invited to certain things, there are many strategies that can be used in the classroom and otherwise. I am an educator, but you're even closer to it, to create inclusion for kids. And there's a sense in which kids are being left to their own device. If they're not included, then they're just left out there, and it just compounds itself, and their kids, you know, parents giving accounts of kids not waking, not eating, they can't get them back to school, they're crying, cyberbullying, they're in their rooms locked up. They take these things quite seriously, especially when it leads to social isolation. The other things we heard was that partnerships and relationships, I'm going to have to go quickly. I want to get to some solutions here. Partnerships and relationship between teachers and families and the communities. There is not enough connection. There's not enough network. Families are not feeling that they're wanted by the schools. So there's missing meaningful relationships between the families and the school. We heard, and I won't read everything here, but there was one person I'd like to quote, where they said, this is the first time anybody has even invited me into a conversation about my child and about racism. And they went on to say, when you're Black, they finish your sentences for you. We need a community that cares about us. They're not sure how to create a relationship with the school, and they don't feel there is a relationship being created. They feel they get called into the school when their kids are, but there's not a relationship with the school. They're not brought into the kind of decision making. They don't know how to network. And if there's one thing I can suggest that could make a world of difference, it's more spaces for parents to connect with each other and with the schools. Parents, there were times we couldn't get them to leave. You know why? They said this was the first time. We knew there were other parents out there like us, and this was the first time we got to just talk about ourselves in a safe way. And one of the things I'll say is that as a racialized minority, when you're in a cross-race setting with other parents, you do not bring up your issues. You often just don't. You feel isolated. You feel if I bring up the issue of my child, it's further stigmatizing my child because everybody else seems happy. So it's important to have safe spaces for parents and to connect parents with, to find ways to facilitate. School can't do everything, but to facilitate those safe spaces. They really appreciated it and really wanted to emphasize, because they want to know how to be part of the school and to assist their children and to work with the schools. I also want to say that the IPOC staff we spoke to and teachers said they've experienced a lot of racism themselves. I have heard fellow teachers in Burnaby schools say very racist things about the students they teach in class. Everything from overt to subtle, from being told to go home, to go back where I come from, to stop talking about racism. A lot of people, IPOC staff, let me just say, IPOC means Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Staff and teachers said that people got really tired of them bringing up racism, and they talked about a professional development day where teachers in my group concluded that students didn't experience racism, and I had to remind them that racism still exists. So there's a disconnect sometimes between the staff and teachers that are from IPOC communities and the ones from the dominant group. And so they are at odds, and the staff and teachers themselves feel isolated and don't feel that they have the same opportunities to advance in the school system. There's also concerns that not enough data is out there. There's not enough support. There's not enough budget, and the sense that funding that gets diverted, that gets put into these issues, often get diverted from the focused groups. Now, let me just say quickly that there are some special cases that I will point to you. I won't go into them, but while all IPOC groups express exclusion, families who are not proficient in English feel particularly excluded. The ELL program was singled out for extensive criticism, ranging from the fact that students felt that they were being pulled out from the population, that they were not being given the opportunity to integrate, that wasn't best learning model, that they felt isolated, that the very program that was meant to support them is othering them, is making them feel that they're not part of the regular. They feel kept back in everything. They felt too much time was away from the regular curriculum. There was a lot of concerns around the ELL program, I will say. In particular, it's probably worth looking at. And that teachers are experiencing, as I said, the job. Black students are, and Indigenous students are particularly all groups are given, okay, let me say this again. All groups of Indigenous, Black, and people of color from a range had issues around racism, but I'd say that the most serious, the most intractable experiences seem to be coming from the Black and Indigenous families in particular. We have an exercise where we asked, about families, about what would make school. We gave them pictures to pick out. That was one of the exercises we did. We had pictures all over the place. We took pictures, explore cards, and we asked people to pick out a picture that would represent for them what would make a school welcoming. And so we got to listen to people's hopes and aspiration. And this was an Indigenous family, and it was quite telling, because in fact what this family did was pick 3 pictures to indicate the ways in which That picture in the middle represented for him how he as an Indigenous person, or there's an Indigenous person, experienced school as completely lost and isolated. And so picked that particular picture. And the other ones was about the fact that, you know, what the one to the right, my right, your right as well, I guess. It was really interesting. What he talked about was the fact that as he came to school and started to meet others, he started to realize that other families from different countries were experiencing the same thing he did. And it really gave him a sense of community, knowing that there are others experiencing the same thing like him. But it was a really intense moment, because he talked about the ways in which he never felt he belonged. He had no mentors, and that time was used against him. And I could go on, but really an intense description about how he experienced school and what a welcoming school was not, in other words. One where you don't feel you fit with other people, where you're isolated and you're not given the time you need. Let me just say, I'm showing you the picture of a young man, and then we will move to the final part of this presentation, which are the suggested solutions and recommendations. Our work and the work you do is so critical. In the middle of our consultations, we received a letter from a father. Some of you might know this, the name of this young man, Tequel Lindell. What's the last name again? Wins. Okay, I can't read it, so I just wanted to be sure. Tequel was shot and died, and I said some of this was going to be hard, and I hope this doesn't trigger his friends and families, but I just wanted to honor the fact that the father took the time to send us quite an extensive letter that was quite insightful. You know, the places he thought that Tequel's life could have taken a different turn, and I wondered if we could just pause just for a minute to remember this young man, because he was a young boy of mixed Indigenous and Black ancestry, and ended up being shot in a drug-related at the tender age of 14 in the Burnaby school district he went to. So we'll just take a moment. Beautiful boy. Of course, his father sent that note in the hope that we would find the solutions and change to ensure that no other child experiences that. So thank you for the moment to think about him and to remember him. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, I love these faces. I think this is what we want, right? We want, every time I look to the right, these kids are smiling, thriving. What does it take? How do we make Burnaby schools safe and welcoming? I heard that is safe, welcoming as one of your goals, flourishing, thriving places of belonging for everyone. Again, knowing that many students are thriving, but some who share their stories are not. And this is the purpose of this report. You want to give me a time check? I just wanted to, yeah. Sorry, what did I do here? Turned it off. When we talk about anti-racist schools, and this is what Burnaby has committed itself to, yeah, okay. And this is what Burnaby has committed itself to. What is an anti-racist education anyway? I think we use terms often, and I think it's important to kind of think about what it is we're saying. I think the first thing is what this says, which is that anti-racist education identifies racism as an organizing principle of social and political structure. In other words, it acknowledges that racism is embedded in many systems, and that it's important to acknowledge and recognize that, and not to keep asking the question over and over, is there really racism occurring? Anti-racism, however, goes further, and it knows that racism is more than just an interpersonal problem. Many times what happens is that we just focus on like what happened, you know, this kid said something to that kid, instead of understanding the structures that's causing that to happen. Structures are things like the pedagogy, you know, it's like what you teach, how you teach, the structures that restrict the diversity of schools, of teachers, so that you don't have a diverse pool of people, that structures that mean that students don't see themselves represented in professional spheres, structures that we could go on of exclusion, meaning many parents, for example, talked about that fact that they felt that their children couldn't get into the preschool and after school care on school property because they are of their color. They were convinced that parents who came after them, who put their names on the list, got in ahead of them. These are structures of exclusion, because we know housing and other, you know, health, all these things do act in ways to create compounding exclusions for kids. So when you look at a family that's here, that's probably of a different color or migration status, think about all the compounding ways when they turn up at school that they're experiencing racism before they even get in the classroom. So if a kid turns up and is a bit disaffected, probably because somebody asked them where they came from. I know that every day I leave my house, somebody does something. I can never figure it out. Like, I'm just leaving my house and somebody will figure out something. Like, when did you arrive in Canada? And for most people, they think that's so benign. It's like a mosquito bite, right? It's like, you sort of think, how long will I live here with my children before I belong? Like, at what point do I actually belong to this society? And so it sort of ruins your day already, you know, or go to the supermarket and somebody follows me. Believe it or not, I had to have a big thing with Shoppers Drug. I shouldn't mention their name, but let's say a outlet, because I was being followed, and I finally just said, please don't do this. I just want to shop. Families are experiencing this all around them, and then they come to school and they need a place of refuge, I would say. And so just, it's important to recognize that, and that it has to be a whole school approach. So it's structural, but it also has to be the whole school. It can't be, it has to be in every aspect of the school. And you might think this is funny, but it should be in the cafeteria too, right? I remember when my school suddenly decided that they're gonna have, instead of hot dog day, and that's a long time ago when my kids were in school, they suddenly decided they could have sushi and patties, Jamaican patties. It occurred to them one day that not everybody eats hot dogs. I'm sure the school has come a long way since then, but it was like a huge thing in my house that there, Jamaican patties were being served. It's like the kids had suddenly, I don't know, been recognized. It has to be across the school. One of the things we do with organizations is to ask ourselves, where would we put the school district on a trajectory? And we do this with all the organizations we work with from left to right. So the further right you get, the more anti-racist you are. And most places are somewhere between hidden and acknowledged, because you see, for most change, and you have to think about this as organizational change or transformational change. That's what the school district is embarking on, is transformational organizational change. And usually what it starts with is, racism is hidden. That is, it's unacknowledged, that it goes on and nobody really talks about it. They say, there are a few bad apples, like the police force says. There's just a few bad apples out there. There's not really systemic racism. And when change starts to happen, it really does start to happen when you acknowledge, and you have to go beyond acknowledging. But if you don't acknowledge the truth, and that's why the truth and reconciliation is called the truth and reconciliation, because you can't reconcile without the truth and acknowledgement. You got to start there and then elevate it. You got to make it a priority. And I see that's happening in the school board. It's got to be a priority, and a priority tells me it's in your budget. Then one of the things you have to do is reimagine your school, to really break things apart, to bring in the people who are at the very center of the issue, in this case, the IMPOC community, and start to rethink what you do in the classroom, even before you think, okay, I know curriculum redesign goes on every year, but it should be a continuous, and I heard that, a continuous improvement. How can we reimagine the things that are in our control and continually change and think about how we could do things differently? And once we've come up with these new strategies, to embed them across the district, so they become your policies and your practices, and it's expected across. We ask students to say, how do you see anti-racism? And they give really nice answers, where they belong, where they feel included. They drew pictures, and we pulled information out of this. Our methodology involved, having students, really talk about their own aspirations. And there is so much we collected, and I wish we had forever, but students have pretty clear ideas, that they want to feel included and belong and part of things, and have the curriculum and learn about their own cultures and contribute. Families were asked to pick pictures of anti-racism, and I heard, I think it was Councillor Hayes, if I got that right, said, maybe it was Councillor Stewart, said the great leveler, that education is a leveler earlier today. Maybe yes, it's Councillor Stewart. And that top when when you have time, you can read this more. It's taped, you can see what is written there. But what was really amazing was how they picked this picture and talked about how people are coming in from different places, but there's a main road running through there. And that's how they saw education in the school, because everybody could come from different places, but they would be able to go on that highway, and that highway would create the great leveling, and they would be able to create this, to get the same education and the same life experiences. The other one there was about connectedness, that to feel connected to the great school community, not marginalized, not on the periphery, but to feel part, to feel belonging, to be central to the issues. So they're pretty clear on how they see anti-racism. But we think in terms of what we're recommending, we believe it needs to start with some principles. And I think tonight, you know, and listening to your reports, some of these principles are already embedded in the school, but how can we apply them to anti-racism? So you have many goals in the school, because you talk about the district average and exceeding it and underperforming against it. I think it's also important that you think about what are your goals. You have to establish and work towards equity goals, and you have to establish what those goals are. I think it's also important that you affirm and accept again, and acknowledge the racism. I think you're going to really need to think about gathering data. And I was listening to the kind of data gathering you do, but it's not disaggregated by race. We really can't tell. And once you got that data on indigeneity, suddenly you know there's a gap. Nobody has to argue anymore. It actually relieves parents of obviously coming every week and saying there's a gap. You know there's a gap because you're measuring it. And you're measuring it in different areas, but we do not measure it by race disaggregated data, as far as I know, except for indigeneity. And I think that would go a long way for you you can't fix what you don't see, and you can't see things that you don't measure. So it's important to start to measure those things. And then you have to have intentional efforts to build institutional capacity. It has to be transparent, and it has to be evidence-based. You need a framework. You need to measure progress. You need to have continuous improvement. And I think most essentially, we think you need to we need to all figure out ways to work more collaboratively with the very communities that are feeling left out, because they know the problem and often know the solution. And they have to also be part of the path out. And the hierarchical ways of thinking, I'll just ask you what the problem is, and then I'm gonna just go fix it myself, likely won't work. And we have provided what we call, recommendations on a page. And I'll go through some of it, but this one slide talks about, first of all, acknowledging anti-racism. And it lays out a series of actions, some of which I'm going to try and cover as quickly as possible, one by one. First of all, when it may seem surprising that I said that we have proposed that acknowledging the deep and structural systemic racism is the first step, and then make a commitment to equity has to be done. I'll tell you what has gone on over time, and it's across systems. One of the ways why we make no progress is that we never leave the starting line. We're always at the starting line. We're always like, oh, We know racism exists. Let's go back here and find out. Let's ask some more people. Let's wait again and discuss it some more. Does it really exist? Are we sure? And it's a way of deniability, right? Because if you keep, if you don't know it exists, then you don't have to do anything about it. And you know, it's interesting how hard it is for people to accept this. This is one of the hardest things in Canadian society. You could call somebody, I don't know, you're a cheat, and they'll go, I don't like that. But you say they're racist? Oh my goodness. You better run for the hills, right? It's something very hard for us to accept, but it's part of our structures, and it's not individual problems. It's a deeply historical thing. We're racist because of historical factors that privileged one race in this country as the dominant group that dispossessed indigenous lands, tried to, you know, enslaved Black people. Most people still don't accept that, and tried to keep all other groups out. Head taxes, we did all sorts of things. We didn't want anybody else but the dominant group here. This was made for white people and the Eurocentric people. And this should not, this is just a historical fact of how this country was called Canada, the Dominion of Canada was constructed. Now, we don't think that way anymore, but the historical legacies live with us. And that's why people think, you know, many of these ideas were embedded in educational systems to justify what was going on. So we taught people that people were inferior. National Geographic used to go and take pictures of people and send them back home. They look how weird and strange these people are. It's part of the ideology we were, and so it's accepting it becomes a little difficult for us for some reason, but the truth is it's not individuals' fault, it's a structural problem. And our structures were built on it, and that's why it exists, and that's why the system privileges certain types of curriculum. It is meant to do that. It was meant to only teach Eurocentric ideas. That's what it was built on. And now we're trying to change that. So we have to acknowledge it. Let's just get past that. And that to recognize and commit to the change. And I do think the next step is in not particular order all the time, but we think that we need to have a permanent structure like the ad hoc anti-racism committee to make permanent governance and decision making that includes all levels of the school system. It needs to be a cross-sectional working committee that's constantly tasked with evaluating anti-racism and inclusion. It's not going to happen without really, really high level, intentional trustees and school district priority. If it's left to its own volition, it will not get there. So how can we govern? What kind of governance structure? We have some ideas we've thought about, some are there, but we need some permanent governance structure. One of the first things that needs to be done, once that's done, is to develop a strategic accountability framework. A framework that tells us what is it we're committed to, what is it we're going to measure, and how we're going to monitor it. And it should be all levels. What will the trustees demand? What will be at the district level? What kind of school level? What are the plans that will emanate from that? So we think you need to collect and track data to make evidence-based decisions. We've said this already. Commit to special goals And that as you reimagine what school should look like, let me see if I can make this really as clear as possible. Most systems that have been developed in hierarchical cultures like this do not have a great way to include the very marginalized and excluded groups in decision making. There are many models. We've got to continuously be bringing in our BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color into the center of the decision making. Because if we don't do that, we don't have the capacity to actually fix the problem. Because it's their experience that we need to understand, and the solution needs to be fit for the problem. And the problem is that often, without understanding the problem deeply, we go off and try and make decisions, and we don't check back in, we don't have mechanisms and network. So whatever that committee looks like, and we have ideas of what that could look like, it needs to center the voice of the Indigenous, Black, and people of color at all levels. There has to be monitoring, and there has to be reporting, just like I heard tonight. If you don't get a report once a year, if you don't get a report at the district level every 3 months, I don't know what it should be. I'm just saying those things. You really don't know if you've made progress. How are you going to know you need to know what the goal is, right? So we need to set that goal. And then we need to measure progress against it. And we need to have measures of how that's going to happen. And we need to make sure the measures are appropriate. So we need to develop anti-racism and equity results-focused policy. We need to establish proper reporting mechanisms. We need to survey and research with racialized employee experience about their structural barriers. And we need to develop what we call a racial equity site. Many people who have to manage and who are in governance have not experienced racism. So how do we develop the capacity for you to see it, for you to plan? That can be done. That can be done with training. That can be done with a variety. We do need more BIPOC people, but we also need everyone to be able to gain this racial equity site in order to address the problem. Teacher diversity must be addressed. Targeted BIPOC hiring and advancement. We think it's important to have networks in the school, such as ERG groups. I know there are such groups developing, but they need to be encouraged. Collegial anti-racism discussion and actions need to be embedded in the school year, not just by those groups, but in the PD days, as part of your regular school development activities. So reviewing recruitment, advancement came up a lot. A lot of teachers felt they didn't know how to become principals. They didn't feel the mechanism was necessarily straightforward for them. They felt excluded from leadership. So addressing those structural barriers. And here is something that came out of the consultations that I thought was really important. And they said, you know, we were trying to talk about how do you've said the problem is that teachers don't have the capacity because of the way they were trained at university, because of lack of life skills. Not because they're great teachers in other ways, right? It's not like they lack capacity. They lack capacity in this specific area. They're great teachers. They know how to do their jobs, but they're not necessarily skilled at figuring out racism, how to deal with it, curriculum, and things like that. So how do we bring in that capacity in a school system with limited resources? And many of the teachers talked about the fact that there was no credentialing and recognition of racial inclusion expertise. That they could bring, modeled after the indigenous enhancement teachers, for example, to support teacher capacity. They said they were called in to help, but they didn't get a special job. They weren't given the time, they weren't credentialed, there's no program, and they really think this could go a long way, because if teachers could be supported in this process by specialists who knew how to create the kinds of experiences in the classroom, to coach them in terms of how to deal with racism, to coach them in terms of a variety of things and provide that support, that even teachers who lack this capacity over time, of course, would learn and increase the capacity across the school system. Because kids can't wait for 5 years until, we solve the representation problem. But what could we do in the short term to start to create the capacity for teachers? And of course, the big issue, even though it seems short, is curricula. If I could say another thing that we could do is, I know that there's curriculum review and the BC curriculum and all of that, but there's a lot of room in curriculum for really creative ways of dealing with inclusion that's within the confine. I teach in a business school, right? When I teach business students. Business students only think rich people matter, right? They just want to learn about Europe and North America and Asia. And I want to teach them about inclusion and the world, right? So my students do projects on establishing businesses in Rwanda and Tanzania. And they come in with that kind of attitude at the beginning, like why would anybody want to know how to do business in Rwanda? And they leave writing me the most incredible, big learning experience. I had stereotypes. I had no idea about these places. I just assumed there were no opportunities. One student said he's taking his Asian business to Rwanda. He was so excited. He was like, I am opening up a business in Rwanda. Lots of ways to create inclusion in the classroom that you don't, assignments that just make the children explore. And then that's where a kid from Eritrea or a kid from Iran suddenly comes into their own, right? Because you have the right assignment, they become experts all of a sudden. And their parents are experts. And the parents said, we'll come into the school. Give us some honorarium. Many of us work poor jobs, but many of us are educated. One of the biggest underused resource in Canada, are immigrants who come to this country and they're doing menial jobs, but they have PhDs and they have masters and they were doctors and nurses. And they have capacity. They're waiting to share it. How can we create that kind of capacity that parent now becomes something of a resource and pride for their children? And I think there are just lots of innovative ways. And these could be, PDD assignments. I think working more on, instead of just telling teachers, you don't have the capacity or the curriculum, working on these innovative, creative, interesting ways to bring in capacity. And I know I need to stop, so I'm going to stop shortly. And I guess parent to parent, I've talked about that and I brought it in. More engagement, peer-to-peer mentoring among parents, bridging the gap between newcomers and the school. I saw, for example, that Ukrainian initiative, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if there are parent groups like this that come into the system and on an annual or semi-annual basis, different things. And I know we spoke to Elda Elder Roberta Price, and she was sharing with us some of the indigenous summer initiatives. And I thought where they're taking kids back to the land. And I brought up with her the idea of racialized kids. And she says, this would be just amazing, right? She says, of course. And sharing. And many people come from indigenous cultures elsewhere, and an ability to connect back to the land. And what happens over summer, this reading club and many other things I see here, thinking more creatively about, I know we don't have a lot of money, but we have ideas. And so how do we use those ideas? So curriculum redesign, big thing. And I've talked about it in creative ways, really important. Bring in partners, bring in parents, bring in cultural organizations. Hogan's Society, we've done a lot of talks around, I'm on the co-chair, we are working to bring back the Black community in Vancouver. But it gives kids, when I walk into, I used to go into classrooms sometimes to give a little talk on Hogan's Alley, and the Black kids sitting there like beaming, right? Because they hear about the fact that there was a Black community in Vancouver, and we're bringing it back. And for that day, if nothing else, they're the center of attention. Suddenly, the expert who's standing giving this thing look like them. And what does that do to a kid? And there are opportunities for that. I put this last thing up because, there's a lot about data, and I've said it many times, and I'll say it again. And by the way, that's a picture of me because I was just named to chair the new legislative committee that's looking on anti-racism data. The new act was passed earlier this year, and schools are going to be, I just know it already, going to be one of the first priority areas. So I think there's going to be a lot of interaction, a lot of data data initiatives that the school can draw on. And of course, the K-12 anti-racism action plan also is looking at creating possibilities for data. So I suspect the schools won't have to do it on their own, but to be part of the process of doing things like graduation rates, transitions, the sorts of things. And it may need different indicators to really get to the heart of what's going on. I'm going to say this last piece here because I think it matters a great deal, and it's racial equity budget. I think we think that, no, I know we think that, that budgets and resources are, these are key indicators of priorities. I just saw an error up there. My teaching skills, I have budgets and resources is. I'm going to have a heart attack. But anyway, budgets and resources are key indicators of priorities. They really are. So when you claim that anti-racism is a big thing and I can't find it in the budget, I know it's not a priority. It's just clear. And racial equity should, and let me make this point, equity means the people who need it the most should get the most. It's not a numbers thing, right? If somebody needs to be dug out from a hole, you're going to have to pay special attention and get out of this sort of, we treat everybody the same. No, you don't. You never did. So if some people are in a hole and you treat them the same, they'll be in the hole forever. We have to do things to put a ladder to them to get out of that hole. So some groups will need disproportionate attention and money in order to create equality. And all budget submissions should include racial equity impact analysis. Budgets should not be sent unless there is an analysis that says this is how it's going to fix the racial equity gap. That's a priority. How does this allocation address and move the gap forward. Because if you're not analyzing how you spend money, I'll give you an example in a practical way. So Vancouver put in all these bike lanes. Okay, but if you look at who bikes to work, you realize that racialized people do not bike to work. They live too far. They don't bike to work. They don't bike to work. Let's just put it this way. So when you put all of your money in bike lanes, I love bike lanes, and there's another thing about bike lanes, but at least we know who it's for. It's for the white people, and you know, I use that in a joking way. It's for the rich people who live on the west side, not just white. Of course, it's all the sort of richer, well-off people who ride to work. And from a racial equity point of view, it tends to skew towards one group. So it means that we're spending Vancouver's money as an advantage to that group when we do infrastructure. At least we should know that. That's all I'm saying. We should know what we're doing. And when we look at it, sometimes it starts to occur to us, wow, we're really only helping some people and we're not doing much to help those other people. So that's why it's important to look at it. So schools that are anti-racist do things proactively to combat structural systemic racism, structural and systemic racism, and work towards equity outcomes. And I put learning and in continuous learning and innovation, I'm going to use a term that was used earlier, continuous improvement. It is a continuous process of measuring, going back, iterating, and fixing it. You never get it right the first time, the second time, or the third time, but it requires constant, diligent efforts. And doing nothing is compliant. It means that you are, in fact, reinforcing the racism that exists. So doing nothing is not an option. And good intentions are not good and not enough. Thank you for that, and thank you so much.